Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways to address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is measuring progress. Measuring progress is an essential element of good project management. Consistent updates on progress reminds leaders and colleagues of the work being done, the success achieved, and the benefits realized once the change is made. It also identifies areas falling short of the plan that need extra resources. The absence of consistent measurement encourages subjective assessments of gains or exaggerations of risks that lead to inertia, knee-jerk responses, distraction, or additional costs. So, how do you measure progress and setbacks to assess the status of a project accurately? My guest today is Søren Pedersen. Søren, welcome to the show.
Hi, Phil. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to a small chat on how to measure progress in changes.
Thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time. And Søren is a consultant, speaker, and leadership coach with over 15 years of systems and transformation experience. He is the co-founder of Building Better Software, a firm that helps convert IT and software organizations to an agile mindset, access organizational alignment, and empower development of teams. Søren holds a Bachelor in Information Technology from the University of Southern Denmark and a Business Administration, Marketing and Marketing Management General from Aarhus University. Søren, what has been your experience with measuring progress during change?
So, Phil, I've had quite some years in the field of change managing organization and doing both large and small scale changes. And I really see two patterns emerge when we do this with our customers and clients out there. When we deal with the smaller change projects, we tend to have like a project plan. It's quite simple and you can easily identify the steps and the training and everything you need in place for this to succeed for the customers. But when we're dealing with large scale transformations, I tend to loop in another part of this, and that's usually the aspect where we deal with the culture of the company. So rather than just having a project plan only, we tend to get a consistent view continuously of the organization, where they are value-wise and what they're doing in their daily work. So it's no longer just enough to measure, are we actually getting some output, are we creating the sessions and the workshops, but we also really want to know, are we getting the results on the other end of the change? And we use a kind of indirect technique where we question the organization, we have them self-assess, and that kind of setup to get that in alignment.
As you do your discovery of the culture that will enable you to measure appropriately and effectively, do you take that mirror of this is what we're seeing in the culture and share it with leaders so that they can reflect on it? Because they might not even be aware of the culture that they're leading.
There are really two parts to that question. We tend to use a self-assessment tool in the organization, and that's open and direct information for all parties. But then we also do our discovery rounds where we go and validate that we're actually seeing that kind of culture and behavior. And there we might draw in some more information and some cases, always anonymous, we don't want to expose people, but to exemplify what are the behaviors and what is the narrative in the organization in terms of what they're doing.
And how does that change or influence how you would measure progress in the organization? Could you give me perhaps two different examples?
The easy one is where we have a project plan and we really do go ahead and measure step by step and track, are we doing the activities we want? The other one is a bit harder. That's where we're dealing with deeper values, core values in the organization. And the only way, as a Danish philosopher once said, is to really ask the organization. And that's where that comes into place in our framework. So we tend to adjust our approach. And key in that discussion is when we're dealing with the values of the organization, we want the leaders to understand what are we measuring and how can they use that measure to move the organization forward? How can they imply nudging tactics or create burning platforms and that kind of information on the backside of the change? And the bigger changes, we never guarantee a deadline because it's impossible to predict when the organization will correct itself.
I find that really progressive because the traditional project management model where you have an end date and then all of the project management methodologies come in and there's aftercare. But often if it's a cultural shift as well, we know that it takes far longer and we can't really define what that endpoint is. What's the reaction from your customers when you say, given where you want to go, we can't define exactly when you will get there?
For many customers, they kind of realize this. Many leaders have been into the position where they experience that culture eats your change or eats your strategy for breakfast. And when we have the dialogue and explain, okay, what you're looking for is, for instance, this agile mindset and these behaviors to come out, rather than us trying to make a 5-year schedule, We'd rather set up a flow where we continuously revisit the organization and make sure the change is anchored and we see the right behaviors come out. And sometimes we have pockets of goodness where we see fast change and people really springing forward. And then we can focus our attention to the more problematic areas of the organizations and keep tracking them in their progress, really. And the leadership teams usually react really nicely towards it, in my experience at least.
And have you ever had a situation where you profile what an agile mindset would be, what the behaviors would be, and structurally how teams would be working, and that goes against potentially what leaders are willing to sign up for? So when you say this is how we'll measure it, there's a disconnect with what you know to be true if you do adapt an agile mindset and their version, which is potentially a lot easier to achieve. Have you found a disconnect where the client really doesn't understand what it takes to be agile?
For sure. We primarily deal in agile and currently DevOps conversions of companies, right? And I think a lot of leaders need to take on a lot of knowledge and change their mindset in this part. But that's why we have the tight engagement with the leadership, and we continuously explain what is the narrative and what is the new state we'd like to see in the organization. And then some of them, of course, we lose those. That's going to happen for sure. But a lot of leaders, when they get the point and they buy into this, you get a lot faster transformation moving forward as well. But that's part of our concept of changing organizations, really. We rarely change organizations. We make organizations able to change themselves with heavy guidance and direction.
And that's a great insight of change as well. You can't force anyone to change for very long, at least. And there's so many examples of organizations that have taken it on very well, which is tremendous, with support from companies like yours. And then there's others where it's, as they say, a flavor of the month, or it seems to be in vogue, but it doesn't stick in the organization. From a measurement standpoint, can you compare the two? Like, how come some are so successful and others that's just, regardless of what support you provide, they don't make that transformation?
The companies where we've had the biggest challenges is where we're not engaged with, for instance, the HR departments, the financial departments, and so on. Because what we tend to see is that when you start going agile, you can get the software guys and the project guys on, they get the stuff and they really like those concepts. But when you get to the budget part and you get to the HR part and the roles and everything in the organization, that tends to become a lot harder to change in that sense. And those CFO guys, they're really good at their job, but they're also really firm on how they want their money counted. To be quite honest. And if we can't open that dialogue, we're not going to be successful other than in an isolated part of the organization.
I'm wondering, from a standard measurement of progress during a transformation, what are the most important elements of change do you measure that would indicate we're making progress or we're having a shortfall?
So as we discussed in the beginning here, right? So we tend to measure our output. So are we getting people trained? Are we getting the right sessions into the teams and the organization, and kind of have an ordinary change plan in that sense? But then we tend to take these self-assessments, as I spoke about, and we quantify those. So we might ask people on a scale from 1 to 5, do you prioritize customer features above one or the other thing? And then we track those measurements in the work to get a more fundamental insight into how are people actually thinking in their organization. But one thing we really stray apart from, where we don't want to go, is we don't want to use those subjective measurements as goal-setting targets. We don't want to go out and say, you have to be on a scale of 1 to 5. You need to be a 4. We'd rather have the teams reflect on where they are and where they need to go to be most efficiently set up to do their job. And what I've seen fail, if we talk about those kind of things, is when you put those numbers into a formula, you set a target, people will start achieving those targets, oddly enough, but we don't see the right behavior because they get to know the real answer and the right answer, but they don't do it in their everyday work. And that's really a big risk to your project.
Isn't it true that once you set a target and you reward achieving that target, you're encouraging people to get the number, but not necessarily what you're looking for behind that number? Say with an organization, if we're at 2 out of 5, then that's really important information that we can process and work with to move us forward. How do you make that case in an organization that has been built on achieving the number? How do you make this different for people in a cultural way?
That ties back to the leadership team really understanding what that measure is and how we collect that data and what we use it for. Because once they understand that if we game this measure, we're going to twist the organization to look somewhat better than it actually is, then they tend to get that into their mind and go with it, really. What I've seen go bad is, probably the CMI model. That's a huge thing if you're dealing with the American Army and so on. And people who tend to get level 5, they tend to do the right things in the exact spots you check. But afterwards, I've seen bosses say, okay, so we took the long route up, but now we are going to figure out how we do this smart right and how we do it right in the long run. And that's kind of, from my viewpoint, is kind of waste that you build into your organization. And when you do this kind of stuff, people tend to get frustrated and you actually challenge your own change in what you're doing, in my view.
And I wonder that, as you say, for taking on a different form of measurement and looking for the accuracy of it, leaders tend to lead the way about how they behave. How do you get that across to a leadership team or a steering committee, the importance that their role modeling will really define what their teams will do or not? Because I find sometimes people intellectually get it, but then they still can't align their behavior with the intent of the initiative.
I think a year and a half ago, we did a transformation for a shipping company, and we spent a lot of energy discussing and explaining leadership, teaching them what right and wrong looks like in the organization. And that's where so we can invest time in the teams. We can try to correct those, or we can work with leadership. And that's where we make a decision as change agents. What are we going to do here? And where do we see the risks towards this project? And how do we handle them based on the measures? And I kind of like the transformational leadership track that you see in the DevOps world, where you have to be able to explain and have a vision of where you're going as a leadership team if you want to lead a transformation. And that's what we really rely on. And then, of course, we do bump into situations where it's really hard to get certain leaders on board, and then we have to escalate and go to a higher level or the sponsor of the project and bring up the risk that this is going to fail if you don't address it.
No, absolutely.
And that's kind of the tough talk, right?
Yes, it is, isn't it? And just it links back to how do you communicate when there are shortfalls? And again, the pressures of being on track or where we want to be. How do you phrase that? Is it just a straight, direct, this person isn't aligned, what are we going to do about it? Or how do you frame it within the culture to escalate and expose a high risk from a leader that's not aligning?
So that would be the straightforward communication. I think as being Europeans and Scandinavians, we have a pretty straightforward culture. So we don't really keep back, but we tend to stick to the ball and not go for the guy in that sense. So we'll just go and say, okay, we're not seeing this move. We're not seeing the leadership team or the leader in himself take action and take responsibility. And what we're really looking for, that linked to the whole part of bringing leadership into control, is that we're looking for commitment from leadership. And when that starts to fail, then we'll have an issue. The way we usually detect it is that when we talk to the organization, we don't get the answers from the people, the staff we would like to see. We don't get stories like, okay, so our leader is really showing this direction and pushing for this kind of path. And we collect those narratives and those evidence-based points from the organization. And we're absolutely critical about sorting in those informations because they can have a political twist as well, right? So you have to be absolutely sure you're shooting at the right target here. But that's a key part. So you could say, going back to your question on measuring, so we measure the outcome-based, so the subjective part, we measure the progress-based ordinary project plan, and then we go and validate that we see those things come back in the organization. That's kind of triangulation of methods.
Can you tell me more about the validation? It's almost a checking the checkers just to trust and verify that the data has integrity. How do you go about doing that? How do you validate that what you're getting back from the teams is actually pure data?
So we tend to have a wide surface of communication across the organization, and we quickly identify key stakeholders where we know we can get a straight answer. And of course, it's all anonymous, right? But we know if we're going to ask this person, we'll get a good view of what's really going on because we've built a degree of trust and collaboration. And usually we go by a paid forward approach. So we know we have to give something before we can actually build that kind of trust.
No, that's great. And I'm wondering if you were working with a company that didn't have a straightforward culture, let's say North America, where perhaps it's a little bit more politicized, if there is a disconnect with leaders, or at least I've worked with some organizations like that. How do you make room in a culture for that straightforward, call it the way that it is at the beginning of a project? Because I've been in circumstances when I haven't done that and have been direct. It's a shock to the system, and I think is less effective than if I had managed that up front.
Yeah, I think, as you say, managing it up front is really, really important. I don't think it takes a long time to spot those deficiencies or realize that something is a bit fishy here, right? With a bit of experience, that becomes quite obvious. And then rather than going out and saying, it can be a bit offensive to people to go and say, this is not good or you're doing wrong, we tend to have a longer track again with these guys to try and see if we can sort it out and consult them into a different mindset. We tend to have an agreement in our company that we really don't want to be political. We want to be straightforward and push people in a good and solid manner. So we don't play that game either. I
No,
think
good for you.
that's a bad route to go.
Absolutely. And even if it means moving on, that you have to keep your
Yeah,
integrity, which is tremendous. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about
exactly.
some of those sort of artifacts of project management. And I'd love your expert opinion on their efficacy, what you think works and doesn't. And let's start with the traditional traffic light, or the green, red, yellow and red, or amber and red, where you're using a color coding system. Is that something that you employ, or is it something that you stay away from?
I tend to steer away from it because I think it becomes too simplified. If you have simple transformations, you implement a new system or you do a simple change, it's okay. But when it's complicated, or even worse, you could say, then we tend to stay away from it, because those traffic lights tend to make people be very decisive in their decisions, and they make erratic actions based on those traffic lights. And it tends to build a bit of strain and frustration in organization when those things occur between parties. And usually it's leadership that goes, oh, this is red. What can we do about it? Or we'll go make orders and so on. And as a project manager, you're really just asking for help. You're not asking for direct intervention. You just want guidance. And that's kind of risky. Usually on the more subjective part, we do use a scale from 1 to 5. And we use those as kind of a traffic light. But rather than saying you have to be at the top of this, we'd look for a realistic goal and set that up in our discussions instead.
The Likert scale of the 1 to 5, it seems so effective. And I think you can actually train people with dialogue about what does a 3 mean versus a 2 or 4. And how about just the dashboards? It's a 1-page picture or imprint of this is where we are. Is that something you use, or is it something that just doesn't reflect the true nature of where you are and how much progress you've made?
We use them, and when we do use them, we really like to have them accompanied by discussion and interaction, so you don't have misreadings or misunderstanding. There are so many options and variables that you have to take into consideration. So right now we're doing a DevOps transformation in a company. Being part of that, we tend to have descriptions for the Likert scale, which are a bit more extensive, so people can actually relate to the behavior, and we tend to define the behavior as we would like to see it in the long run. So we start to build that kind of notion in people as well when they answer. It's not just a flat 1 to 5.
Do you extend that to a maturity model? This is where we are now at 1 or 0, and over the next 2 or 3 years, we'll progress with hopefully getting to 4 and 5. Have you ever employed that? There's different categories, and you're evaluating from 1 to 5 on each of those. It could be process, it could be capability. Is that something you use, or is it just something to stay away from?
That's what we do right now. The good part about that is if you have, so let's say a team or an area comes out as a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the best, obviously, right? Then they have a sort of ladder they can climb. They get some guidance and they can dig deeper on their own. And that's really efficient when it comes to these kind of changes. So let's say you have a large gap. You might tend to flavor those steps in some easier steps. And then when you get further down the road, you redefine and change the scope or the extent of the steps you're doing, so you can leverage in multiple rounds. Otherwise, you might impose too far a distance and people will get really frustrated and just resign in the change. And that's just the biggest risk, right?
Right. That's very perceptive. If it looks like it's a bridge too far, or, hey, we'll never get there, then why even try to get there? One thing I find with maturity models is that they scale really well, whether it's across departments or even business units or divisions, that you get one language for measurement. Has that helped you out too with some of the larger organizations that are geographically dispersed, or there's multiple divisions that aggregate up into the total company?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good mean. We tend to work towards a tribe language. So the transformation I did before the one we're doing here, we wrote like a basic curriculum or basic ways of working. And that was really powerful for communicating what it is we expect from the organization and the different parties involved. And once you have that language, you can start to align people and their expectations. And that's really helpful in my view.
You'd mentioned earlier about the types of things that you would measure and the subjective parts and sort of the more quantitative. How do they work together so that the raw data and then also the impressions of where we are, the subjective 1 to 5s, how do you blend the two together to create an accurate picture of where the organization is?
What we like to do is to do a full assessment, and we do that on a cadence, you could say. We like to do the project status report. What did we expect to do and where are we in that part? Then we'll do the self-assessment part. We get that kind of insight. And then we'll collect, you could say, war stories or worthwhile lessons in the organization and build them in and explain. So what was a success and what worked and where are we going to push the next time to move the organization in the right direction? And What we really love to see is that, let's say we have a big organization with multiple teams. We get one team to get it, and then they do an exponential rollout because they start teaching their colleagues and their friends, and then we kind of push it out that way to scale the implementation efforts.
And how do you pick that pilot team? Is it the one that's the most keen to do so, or is it the one that has the highest value? How do you pick that one that will be the model for all others as you scale?
What tends to be the problem is that we need to create change capacity. Usually organizations are pretty loaded and nobody's sitting around waiting for more work. So we try to find simple cases where we can remove some strain or make some headroom by doing some simple small changes. And when they start building this change capacity, they're good candidates. And obviously we're looking for traits. So we're looking for people who have a propensity to reach out in an organization and be like a network node connected to others and not afraid of sharing and helping out other people. Sometimes we can't find those, then we have to train them and educate a team.
You raised a really interesting point about not only capacity to change, but even capacity to be able to manage change, but even the capacity to take on the change that you're looking for. What do you recommend before you start measuring? When you look at the organization, you've done your discovery, and people are just so busy with multiple projects, there's no capacity to take on the one that you've been hired to bring on. How do you manage that before you even start measuring your progress?
Yeah, that's a good one. How do you bootstrap that? So basically, it's about finding those radicals in the organization where you can get a bit of leverage. There's always somewhere where you can actually find a team that'll be a bit more bold, or you'll find a leader who says, this we need to do, I'll create the room. What we tend to see out there is that companies have allocated 10, 15, 20% for change, but they never really got used. And we deal with that in the current setup. And I have to comment on one of my good colleagues in that setup as well, by focusing the effort. So we go to a team, say, can you pull out all of Monday to fix stuff that's broken? And when they get the flow of change going and they start to get into a better situation, it all escalates from there on. That's the hard part.
Yeah, it is. I asked you the question because I don't know the answer and I need it. So thank you. I'm taking notes. You talked about different cultures and measurement can vary based on culture. Does co-creation with the people who are actually taking on the change, how does participation work in measuring progress?
Oh, that's a huge game changer. So for instance, when I've worked with Indian companies or Eastern European companies, they're a bit more attentive to following the rules and being the good example or showing they can do this stuff. So there we are a bit more conservative about sharing the measurements and using those as leverage in the organization. And I mean, it shouldn't come across as that's the general norm in India, but that's just my experience.
Have you ever had a transformation, as an example, halfway through, you realize that either you're measuring the wrong things or by changing how you measure it will give you more accurate data? So have you ever had a circumstance where you change the way you measure based on the evidence that you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in my less experienced days a while back, I would tend to go primarily for the pure output model, right? Have we done this? Have we described this? Are we doing this kind of stuff? And from personal reflections, I realized that this would actually tend to create the wrong behavior and the wrong experience in the organization. And I also got into some severe conflicts because I knew this was right, but people were not really ready to take it in and work in that kind of way. I had a project plan and I was being followed on that project plan and we needed a success, right? And that I had to learn from and grow a different perspective.
That's great learning. And I think the realization of making the change versus keeping with something that's not effective is brilliant. But again, the pressure, great tips to the listeners. How much detail is required when you are measuring progress? Are there some general tips there that you could share with the listeners?
So based on the work I'm doing right now, I think measuring the subjective part, the self-assessment part, is a half yearly at maximum or yearly event that you do, because we usually have between 20 and 50 questions with a scale of 1 to 5 for each question. And that's quite a bit to answer and relate to as a team. The other part would do monthly stages or bi-weekly stages and so on. We tend to follow the agile methods like Scrum or whatever. And the complex projects, we have a product backlog. So we have a continuous dialogue with the leadership team of what are we observing, what are we measuring, and where do we want to put our effort next to create maximum value. That requires an agile mindset from the go-get, right?
Any tips for the listeners, given your focus on building Agile into an organization, some of the nuances of measuring progress in an Agile mindset versus, as you say, some of the smaller or more traditional project-led transformations?
Yeah. I think many of the Agile transformations, and now we see DevOps coming in as huge initiatives as well, people should realize they're going to fail. They're going to trip a few times, and it takes a bit of courage to get into that mindset. But you really just have to get going and then fail a few times to get your bearings and your understanding right. And that's an exercise of courage.
It is, absolutely. The first time somebody fails, everybody else in the organization is looking at whether it's a learning opportunity or whether it's a chance to reprimand someone for failing. And how do you make that initial transition? Because I worked with one organization that all the indications were there that they wanted to move into an Agile mindset. And unfortunately, the poor, courageous individual that made the first mistake received almost a reprimand, or I would even say a slight humiliation in front of everyone else for failing. How do you coach people that this is a measure too? How you behave in a new way is part of the measurement of making the transition.
Oh, wow. So then you're really in a what you call a toxic culture if you have that kind of scapegoating going on. I think as an individual, you have to consider, can you actually leverage this organization? And if you believe you can, you need to start working on creating room for errors and making that a valid thing in the organization. I tend to have a dialogue with leaders and I discuss with them. So my key point to them is that, right, we're looking for a learning organization. We want an organization where we can make mistakes and learn from it. And the way we do that is we stop talking about only success stories. We talk about learning and failing in that part as well. And that tends to grow a certain understanding of failures being a huge part of what we do. And we're not really failing, we're just learning. That's the wrong way to go. That's really, really tricky. And that can be a hard thing to solve in an organization, really.
Are there any other lessons learned like that? Because you've shared so many today in the sense of how to set up measurement, how to measure well, and how to progress getting to where you're going. Any other tips that you'd share with someone? If you're going to measure progress, these are things to be mindful of.
So I think you put out some good points in your book on being very specific on what you're measuring, who's collecting, and getting all that in place. And I think my advice on top of that is be very scarce with your measurements for a start until you get that flowing. Start with 3, 4, 5 measurements. And as you get rolling, you might figure out that you can do other measurements that might support you. I tend to see, and used to do it on my own as well, people tend to make stuff really complicated. And then you get in trouble, right? Because you can't maintain it and you can't really explain what are you seeing in the organization and so on. So start small, get clear on how you do things, and then move up on the ladder. And you might want to change your measurements along the way. Maybe you don't want to measure the same all the time. So if you move from a maturity stage to another stage, you might find some other measurements useful. Be open to that.
Excellent. That's great advice. And in the spirit of change on the run, and given how busy everyone is and organizations moving so quickly, if you came in and there's only one thing you could do, one action to measure progress in an organization, what would that be? The one that would give you the 80% results in 20% of the time?
I would start asking people how they feel about their job. And that's based on a bit of theory. You could say, if you go back to Daniel Pink, he'd say purpose, mastery, and autonomy are really key elements. And when those start to fail, then you get I usually use the term ENPS, Employee Net Promoter Score.
Right.
And if that is really bad, then you can start looking at those 3 topics and find your way from there. That's a good reading of how well situated the organization is.
That is great advice, Søren. Thank you so much. And as we close off the show, is there anything that you'd like to underscore, or a tip or a watch out, or something to consider for the listeners?
I think daring to take the first step is really key. You're going to be wrong, but the only way you'll learn this stuff is to try it out. And that's the hard route, but that's how it goes.
Thank you so much. It's a great lesson. And I think it goes against what we've been brought up over the years of what good looks like. But I think it comes down to the courage to do that and take that first step. How can people get a hold of you or connect with you? Because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people wanting to start the conversation based on our discussion today.
So people are very welcome to reach out on LinkedIn. My profile is public and I answer to all questions basically. And otherwise, they can look up our contact details on buildingbettersoftware.com. And we always have half an hour for ad hoc consultancy if people have questions and so on. So they are more than welcome to reach out.
Thank you, Søren. So appreciate you being on the show. And I've got one last question for you. Looking at your company profile, you build amazing organizations. Could you define what that is? Because I found it really inspiring.
Oh, yeah. So what we want to see is really organizations where people thrive. In my past, I've talked a bit about how you create autonomous teams and so on. And we really believe strongly that if people are satisfied and they thrive, they're going to do a good job for you and your customers, and people will be happy to work for you. And that's what we believe is a great organization.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you being on the show. Thank you for taking the time. And for listeners, thank you so much for listening. And if you find it of value, perhaps you could share it with somebody that's looking for support with measuring progress. And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.